Welcome to WHU Inside Business. I'm here today with Michael Lierow. Michael is a partner at Oliver Wyman. Michael, thanks very much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me here.
What I would like to talk to you about today is the digital supply chain. Digital seems to be all the rage. It's there's no newspaper article without it. So can you tell us a little bit what is really new about digital supply chains and what is kind of old stuff, maybe at a larger scale?
Sure. I mean, I agree. Digital is, pretty much the flavor of the day. Now, everybody talks about digital, and a lot of the digital stuff that we hear these days, is nothing but hot air. So the real challenge is to filter out the things that truly mean a value add for the companies today and help the CEOs of this world to decide what really matters and what does not matter. Now, in terms of digital supply chain, a lot of the elements have been there already 30 years back. If we talk about big data, if we talk about the algorithms that are used today, those are all, you probably have been part of that, been published like 20, 30 years back. So this is not new. What actually is new is that a lot of the data is available and we have the means of putting the data together. And on the other side, there's a lot more complexity in the supply chains of today. And that means this volatility is driving the need for better supply chains, for more efficient supply chains, for a deeper connection between the sales side on the one side and the operation, the supply chain side on the other side. And that really is different. And because of this, digital means additional opportunities and obviously for the companies who don't do it, a lot of additional risk.
Okay. You mentioned data and the new types of data sources. Can you tell us a little more about the process, how we get from data to knowledge to ultimately better decisions?
Yeah. I mean, when we do this project and we have the discussions with the companies, the first question is, what does the company really need in terms of supply chain? So in terms of service levels, in terms of cost levels, what really is the strategy of the company? If we take a distribution company, for example, ultimately it's the customer who's driving. So does the customer want to have next day delivery? Do they want to have same day delivery? In terms of a textile company, do they want to show the trousers and the shirt at the same time in the shop? So all these are requirements that then translate into what the supply chain really has to deliver. And based on this, we identify the sources of interesting, data pieces from actually the store up to where the supplier or the manufacturer is sitting. Now, pulling these data pieces together actually gives us an interesting view and transparency of the supply chain as such. And then, of course, then the source for further analysis and analytics of the supply chain.
Right. To what extent do you weave together data that is within the company, but also external data such as tweets, Facebook data, weather data, and so forth?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the most important parts of actually creating a holistic transparency on the supply chain side, that you include data that is not the sales data or not even the basic data of a certain product. But if you talk about, for example, demand forecasting with machine learning, a lot of what we do is we take into account features from external sources. That might be Twitter, that might be Facebook, that might be weather data, that might be all kinds of things. And the same holds true actually if you move upwards on the supply chain side. Of course, there you have contextual data as well, and you need to make sure that from the data you extract the interesting features and pull that together. So that's a big source of interesting information that can help to make the supply chain more accurate, reduce the costs and ultimately make it more reliable.
Okay. It sounds as though this kind of data gathering and feature extraction is sounds like a relatively straightforward task to do. How does a company then create a lasting competitive advantage from having these new data sources?
Well, if you would design, if you designed a company greenfield, it probably is pretty much straightforward. But the companies are not designed greenfield. They have legacy IT systems with most of the time not a single database, but different databases. You talk about multiple steps in the supply chain, so it's different companies that you need to add to that. You talk about features that sit in different databases. So all of that is a landscape that you need to bring together. That's the first point. The second point that's pretty interesting is the supply chain isn't static. You have new products, you have new speeds that you need. You have, new network configurations that are happening. And all of these need to somehow be reflected in the data and thus as well in the analytics that you do.
Okay.
And that indeed is nothing that a company has, just off the shelf, but it's really something where a company needs to carefully evaluate where does it make sense to put effort in order to extract data, and what is the value that it gets back for it, and where frankly, does it remain, a dream and it's nice to have, but it doesn't make a lot of sense because it's just too expensive, or the marginal use isn't there at the end.
Okay. Can you give us from the cases that you have worked on, can you give us an indication about what type of benefits you can expect if you move towards a digital supply chain?
Sure, of course, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the pure supply chain effects, you have both cost side effects on the one side and increased service level effects on the other side. And depending on where your strategic goal is, you can tweak it either in the one or the other direction. So in terms of cost level, of course, you can reduce inventories, some of the classical levers. You can become better in your transportation, in your network configuration, and so on. The very interesting levers are beyond the classical ones. For example, if you connect the sales side to the operation side, so you say, I can sell to the customer new or different products because the capabilities of my supply chain are a lot better than they have been before. To give you an example, if I would sell a complex machinery, and I can say, I don't only sell the machinery to you, but I sell it including a maintenance contract, and this maintenance contract guarantees you only a very, very limited downtime. Now, why can I do that? Because I have predictive maintenance, I have predictive analytics in there, I have a predictive supply chain that probably does as well predictive shipping. So it knows not exactly, but a lot better than before when and where to have certain spare parts. So I change the product that I ultimately sell to the customer because the supply chain has become a strategic element and has become a lot more than in the past, where basically it was just shuffling stuff along and more or less it did work. And that's the case for a lot of companies. The same if you go, for example, into retail. You can think about, specific pricing to customers, specific bundling to customers. If you put a steak in your basket, and the app would already tell you, now you put a steak in your basket and you absolutely need to have this fantastic barbecue sauce. Now I do a bundling pricing for you. Because that's been predicted, and there's a higher likelihood that you buy that, you have more steak sauces actually in your inventory than you'd normally have. So there's a lot of ways you can play back and forth, and you can actually connect the sales side, to the operation side and to the supply chain side. And by this, of course, not only augment the value for the company, but ultimately in this case as well for the end consumer. What is the goal and ultimately what's driving it, no?
Michael, let's talk about the capabilities that are required in order to harvest the potential gains from combining data with new products or services. What do you think, what are the most critical capabilities that firms need to establish?
That's a very, very important question. I mean, it's not just purely on the IT side or on the data side. You really need to create a more holistic, kind of platform, a kind of ecosystem to make that work. For example, you need to look at how are the decisions made in the company on the sales side, on the supply chain side, how you bring that together. You need to think about incentivizing the people. You need to think about governance. You need to think about KPI structures before IT. What do you measure? What does success look like for you? How do you want to strategically steer the company? We've seen it a couple of times that company just started to hire a couple of IT experts and thought about a bit about mid-layer system on the data side, and they get a pilot going and they make good first steps. But then comes the question on how do you going to make that work not only for 0.5% or 1% of your products, but for 20, 30, 40% of your products. This is where it becomes interesting. The scaling actually makes the effect that hits the bottom line at the end. And this is where you can sustainably differentiate, because there are currently not that many firms that walk into that direction, understand the transformative nature of this whole event, and isolate the critical elements. Where does digitalization of the supply chain work, and where does it not work, and how to steer that in a company. That is critical, and that will help companies to be successful at the end.
Okay, how does the management of the firm create a sense of urgency? What do you think? How do you get this from the top leadership of the firm into the organization?
So from my experience, to be very frank, urgency comes from either pain or smoking guns. So currently the pain is felt a little bit by some retail companies because companies like Amazon and others are pushing a lot. But most of the time it comes from good examples that the companies, and especially at the C-level, realize on when and where the impact is. If you read about digitalization, about Industry 4.0 and about all these kind of things, it's difficult to really distinguish on what is truly impactful and what is not impactful. So for the companies, it matters at the beginning to get a very good understanding of a couple of important areas where they can win and leaving the others out and distilling those and finding the kernel of where is really true value and P&L impact at the end. Once that is established, then often you can create a good alignment within the management team and start driving things. I mean, it's a transformative process. I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day, so the digitalization of an old analog offline company doesn't happen in a day. But it's important to get a diagnosis going on to see where the impact is, and then get in a couple of steps implementation going, harvest on the way, increase the cultural change over time, and make sure that you slowly but surely, harvest and benefit the opportunities that are out there.
Okay. We talked quite a bit about the value of data. What do you think, how well equipped are companies to protect the data, speaking about cybersecurity, about data leaks and so forth? Do you think that there's room for improvement?
There's absolutely room for improvement. Very big topic in the industry and very important topic. And I'm looking at this from two different perspectives. One is a shift in value that we see happening, kind of natural with digitalization, and that leads to new players becoming owners of very interesting data and can do a lot with the data. And I'll come to that in a second. And the second element is then indeed what you would refer to like hacker attacks, cybersecurity, and all these kind of elements. There's a lot of companies on the cybersecurity side which need to augment their skills and need to make sure they actually protect not only their customers' data, but actually their core data in terms of what is a competitive advantage. Now, the value shifting idea is a very interesting one because we see that companies, especially platforms that are building up, they kind of suck in data from different sources and different elements and build a new value creation around it, or build value around this. And ultimately, one nice example is last mile logistics. Decide, which kind of channel last mile logistics goes. If we talk about a blockchain for supply chain, another important topic where, yes, you have different ledgers and thus it's kind of more difficult to hack, but on the other side, you have a lot of data from the supply chain that is together out there. So, there is a potential actually indeed to think about cybersecurity in this respect and whether a company should, upload their data and be part of that. It's a strategic question. If you don't, you're likely missing out on some part, but if you do, obviously as well, there's a risk which you carefully need to weigh out at the end.
Okay. Michael, one last question. We talked about the potential of digital. Now, how does that translate into requirements for new employees? What does it take to be a consultant in this era of digitization?
So, I mean, it depends a bit on where and how you want to join. We have the normal general entry consultants, and for them it's still important to be very flexible, to learn as the same way as it was before. Honestly, I mean, of course, let's make no doubt about this. A special interest in digitalization, may that be through internships, may it be through practical experience in Python and machine learning, is always a big benefit. Of course, it's not 100% of the projects we do, but of course, as well, it's an increasing share and it becomes relevant. On the other side, if you want to enter in a kind of a digital world, we have created a department, a very large department globally that's called Oliver Wyman Labs. And within this Oliver Wyman Labs, you have specialists from OR expertise, programming, but as well consulting expertise to make sure that we can, do big data transformation, big data analytics. These guys do app programming. They do all the fancy things that really help us to not only think about the high-level strategy, but to honestly deliver it and make sure it's implemented in the customer's business. And of course, depending on where you want to go in, depending on what you want to do, there's a different skill set to that. Ultimately, it's still continuing being flexible, having fun, being eager to learn, and enjoying the multi-facets of a consulting business.
Excellent. Sounds terrific. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me here. Great. Thanks.